What happens when a day that is supposed to feel meaningful arrives, and nothing inside you moves in response to it? And why do some people move through Christmas without anticipation, without resistance, and without the sense that anything special is taking place? Today, we explore the psychology behind why certain individuals experience Christmas as ordinary, how emotional meaning slowly disconnects from ritual, and what it reveals about the way stability, expectation, and self-regulation shape human experience. If you're drawn to quiet reflection, calm storytelling, and psychological insight that looks beneath the surface of everyday experience, consider subscribing and staying with the journey. For some people, Christmas does not arrive with anticipation or emotional movement, but instead passes through their awareness in the same way any other day does, quietly, predictably, and without creating a noticeable shift in how the world feels or how they position themselves within it. This experience is often misunderstood from the outside and quickly labeled as emotional distance, bitterness, or a lack of warmth. Yet psychologically, it is rarely rooted in emptiness, and much more often shaped by a gradual recalibration of how meaning is allowed to form and where it is permitted to come from. Meaning, especially the kind attached to cultural rituals, does not disappear suddenly or dramatically, but erodes through repetition, through inconsistency, and through subtle moments where expectation is created but not fulfilled in a way that feels real or sustaining. Over time, the mind begins to adjust, not as an act of rejection, but as a form of emotional efficiency, slowly learning which experiences deserve investment and which ones repeatedly fail to return anything that feels stable or genuine. Christmas, for many, is built on externally reinforced meaning, supported by shared stories, collective emotion, and the assumption that connection, warmth, and recognition will naturally appear because the calendar insists they should. Yet the nervous system does not respond to symbolic dates, but to lived patterns. When a person moves through Christmas year after year without emotional alignment, without authentic connection, or without a sense that the day reflects their internal reality, the brain begins to decouple the ritual from its expected emotional outcome. This process is rarely conscious and almost never intentional, unfolding instead as a quiet internal update where anticipation slowly lowers and emotional preparation becomes unnecessary. In the earlier stages, there may still be effort, participation, and outward compliance, where the person attends, engages, and follows the structure of the day while internally noticing that the emotional return feels inconsistent, hollow, or simply absent. The mind notices these inconsistencies, not with judgment, but with memory, storing each experience as data that gradually reshapes future expectations. Expectation, psychologically, is costly because it requires openness, readiness, and vulnerability. And when that openness repeatedly leads to disappointment or emotional flatness, the nervous system adapts by reducing the intensity of future anticipation. Eventually, this adaptation becomes the default emotional posture, where Christmas no longer produces internal movement, not because the person is numb, but because the mind has learned that neutrality feels more stable than hope. Neutrality, in this context, is often mistaken for emotional shutdown, yet it functions more as a regulated state, where emotional energy is conserved rather than suppressed. For people who experience Christmas as an ordinary day, this neutrality often reflects a broader internal orientation, where meaning is no longer sourced from collective rituals or external validation, but from internal consistency and emotional self-trust. Meaning does not vanish in these individuals, but relocates, settling into private routines, predictable rhythms, controlled environments, and moments of quiet alignment that occur independently of tradition or ceremony. From the outside, this can appear as indifference, yet internally, it often feels like balance, because there is no pressure to perform emotion or synchronize with a collective mood that does not naturally resonate. There is also a layer of psychological self-protection embedded in this pattern, because special days amplify contrast, highlighting absence, mismatch, or unmet assumptions, which can create internal tension for those whose past experiences have taught them that emotional promises are unreliable. By treating Christmas as ordinary, the individual reduces friction between expectation and reality, allowing the day to pass without emotional strain or internal conflict. This shift does not occur in a single year, but develops through accumulated moments, small adjustments, and repeated realizations that anticipation often demands more than it gives. Perhaps there were earlier years filled with quiet hope that the day would feel different, warmer, or more connected, and perhaps those hopes faded not through heartbreak, but through repetition without resolution. The brain, functioning as a prediction system, updates itself accordingly, gradually stopping the production of expectations that consistently fail to materialize. When December arrives, there is no emotional spike or internal preparation, only continuity, as the day fits smoothly into the existing structure of life without demanding special attention. This smoothness often feels relieving because it removes the obligation to feel something on command or to extract meaning from a situation that does not naturally produce it. Rather than resisting Christmas, the person simply does not respond to it, allowing it to exist without emotional charge. Identity also plays a role, particularly for individuals who have developed strong self-reliance or emotional containment, where collective rituals can feel intrusive, disrupting internal order rather than providing comfort. Over time, the attempt to synchronize with external emotional rhythms fades, replaced by trust in one's own internal state. The question of why Christmas does not feel special eventually disappears, not through denial, but through acceptance of difference. Christmas becomes understood intellectually, but remains emotionally neutral, passing through awareness without resistance or attachment. This detachment is quiet and often invisible, rarely announced or explained, as the person continues to function, participate when necessary, and move through the day with composure. Importantly, this state is not always accompanied by sadness, and in many cases is accompanied by clarity, because the absence of imposed meaning allows the individual to remain grounded in what feels real to them. There is no pressure to perform gratitude, no obligation to manufacture warmth, and no expectation to conform emotionally to a narrative that feels external rather than lived. Psychologically, this reflects a transition from externally driven meaning to internally regulated experience, where emotional cues are trusted only when they arise naturally. Connection is not rejected, but no longer scheduled, and intimacy is not dismissed, but no longer assumed to arrive on symbolic dates. For these individuals, meaningful moments tend to emerge quietly, without ceremony, often on ordinary days that carry no expectations at all. In this context, Christmas is not disappointing or painful, but simply irrelevant, because relevance, more than tradition, determines emotional response. When a ritual no longer aligns with lived experience, the mind allows it to pass without resistance, without argument, and without the need to redefine it. It becomes another day moving through time at the same pace as all the others, not because something is missing within the person, but because something fundamental has shifted in how meaning is permitted to enter their life. For many people who experience Christmas as a normal day, the shift does not come from disappointment alone, but from a deeper psychological development where emotional regulation gradually becomes internal rather than relational, reducing the need for shared rituals to anchor their sense of stability. Emotional self-sufficiency often develops early, sometimes through necessity rather than choice, forming in environments where support was inconsistent, where emotional needs were met unpredictably, or where reliance on others felt uncertain rather than safe. In these conditions, the mind learns to minimize dependency, not by rejecting connection outright, but by reducing the emotional weight placed on moments that require others to show up in a particular way. Over time, this internal orientation becomes habitual, shaping how meaning is processed and how significance is assigned to events that are designed to be shared rather than self-contained. Christmas, by its nature, assumes emotional interdependence, shared attention, synchronized feeling, and mutual participation, all of which can feel unnecessary or even disruptive to individuals whose internal systems are already stable without external reinforcement. Rather than feeling excluded from the ritual, these individuals often feel untouched by it, observing the structure without sensing a personal need to enter it emotionally. This is not withdrawal in the dramatic sense, but a quiet exit that occurs without conflict, explanation, or visible resistance. The person may still attend gatherings, exchange words, or move through the social mechanics of the day, while internally remaining anchored to their own rhythm, unaffected by the emotional expectations surrounding them. Psychologically, this reflects a shift away from relational regulation, where emotions are stabilized through shared experience, towards self-regulation, where internal equilibrium is maintained independently of social context. When emotions are self-regulated, special occasions lose their regulatory function because the individual no longer needs them to feel grounded, connected, or oriented within themselves. This internal stability can make rituals feel redundant rather than comforting, especially when they introduce unpredictability, emotional noise, or pressure to respond in a particular way. For someone accustomed to managing their inner world privately, the emotional density of Christmas can feel excessive, not because it is overwhelming, but because it interferes with an already balanced internal state. As a result, treating Christmas as a normal day becomes a way of preserving internal coherence rather than rejecting collective meaning. There is often a subtle confidence embedded in this pattern, though it is rarely expressed outwardly, because the individual does not rely on visible markers of belonging to validate their emotional experience. Their sense of self remains intact regardless of whether the day is marked, celebrated, or ignored, which makes participation optional rather than necessary. This optionality changes the emotional relationship to the holiday entirely, removing urgency, longing, or expectation from the experience. Instead of asking what the day is supposed to provide, the individual simply observes what it actually does and often finds that it offers nothing they do not already possess internally. This realization is rarely articulated, but deeply felt, reinforcing the decision to remain emotionally neutral rather than invested. In many cases, this emotional independence was reinforced through long periods of solitude, responsibility, or self-reliance, where the individual learned to meet their own needs without waiting for alignment from others. Over time, these patterns solidify, creating a psychological environment where internal order is prioritized over collective participation. Rituals that require emotional synchronization can then feel like interruptions rather than opportunities, pulling attention outward when the individual is accustomed to staying inwardly steady. This does not mean the person lacks empathy or social awareness, but that their emotional equilibrium does not depend on shared intensity. They can understand why the day matters to others without feeling compelled to mirror that significance internally. This separation between understanding and feeling allows them to move through Christmas with calm detachment rather than internal conflict. From the outside, this may appear as emotional distance, yet internally it often feels like alignment, because there is no dissonance between expectation and experience. Another psychological layer involves control, particularly emotional control, which becomes more valuable to individuals who have learned that unpredictability often carries emotional cost. Special days amplify variables, social dynamics, unresolved tensions, and emotional demands, all of which introduce uncertainty into the internal system. By treating Christmas as ordinary, the individual minimizes exposure to these variables, maintaining predictability and internal balance. This preference for predictability is not rooted in fear, but in familiarity. As the mind gravitates toward environments it knows how to navigate efficiently. Over time, the emotional reward of stability outweighs the potential reward of participation, making neutrality the most comfortable position. The individual does not consciously reject tradition, but simply stops organizing their inner world around it. Christmas becomes something that exists externally, moving through the social environment, while the person remains internally unchanged. This separation allows them to engage selectively, choosing when and how to participate without emotional obligation. In this way, emotional self-sufficiency functions as a filter, allowing only experiences that resonate internally to carry weight, while others pass through without attachment. The absence of emotional reaction does not indicate emptiness, but discernment, shaped by years of learning where stability is found and where it is not. As a result, Christmas loses its power to disrupt, excite, or disappoint, settling instead into the background of daily life. The individual moves through the day with the same emotional posture they carry through all others. Grounded, self-contained, and internally consistent. There is no sense of loss in this posture, because nothing essential feels missing. What others experience as a highlight, the individual experiences as continuity. And within that continuity, there is often a quiet sense of control, coherence, and emotional sufficiency that makes celebration unnecessary rather than undesirable. For many people who experience Christmas as an ordinary day, the emotional shift is shaped less by a single defining moment and more by the slow accumulation of memory, where repeated experiences quietly rewrite the meaning the day once carried. Memory does not store events as isolated facts, but as emotional patterns, layering sensation, expectation, and outcome into a structure the mind uses to predict what will happen next. When Christmas repeatedly unfolds in ways that feel emotionally flat, performative, or misaligned, the brain begins to register the day not as a source of renewal, but as a predictable sequence with limited emotional return. This does not require overt conflict or visible disappointment, because even mild emotional mismatch, when repeated often enough, is enough to reshape internal expectation. Over time, the mind learns not to anticipate depth where it has rarely appeared, and this learning occurs quietly, without resistance, without resentment, and often without conscious awareness. What remains is not bitterness, but familiarity, where the day becomes known in advance, stripped of surprise, and therefore stripped of emotional charge. Disappointment, in this context, is not dramatic or painful, but cumulative, forming through small moments where the promise of connection, warmth, or meaning fails to materialize in a way that feels real. Each instance may seem insignificant on its own, but together they form a consistent pattern that the brain treats as reliable information. The cost of repetition lies in this reliability, because once an outcome becomes predictable, the mind stops investing energy into anticipating something different. Christmas, which relies heavily on anticipation, loses its psychological leverage when anticipation no longer feels justified. The individual may still remember earlier years when the day carried emotional color, when hope or curiosity existed, but those memories gradually lose their influence as newer experiences take precedence. Memory is not loyal to nostalgia, but to recency and repetition, prioritizing what happens most often over what happened first. As a result, even positive early associations fade when they are not reinforced, leaving behind a neutral emotional template that defines how the day is experienced in the present. This neutral template does not erase feeling entirely, but limits emotional range, keeping responses contained and proportional to what history suggests is likely to occur. In this way, treating Christmas as a normal day becomes an adaptive response to accumulated data rather than a conscious stance or emotional withdrawal. The individual is not choosing to disengage, but following an internal model that has been refined through lived experience. This refinement often extends beyond Christmas, influencing how the person relates to other symbolic or emotionally charged moments that rely heavily on expectation rather than substance. When meaning is promised repeatedly but delivered inconsistently, the mind begins to trust experience over narrative. Social stories surrounding Christmas often emphasize transformation, closeness, and emotional resolution. Yet when these outcomes fail to appear consistently, the contrast between story and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Rather than clinging to the story, the mind releases it, preferring accuracy over hope. This release does not require emotional suppression because the adjustment happens at the level of prediction rather than feeling. The individual simply stops expecting something different, allowing the day to unfold without emotional investment. In many cases, this shift is reinforced by environments where Christmas is associated with tension, unspoken conflict, or emotional performance, rather than genuine presence. Even when overt negativity is absent, subtle emotional strain can be enough to discourage anticipation, especially for individuals who are sensitive to inconsistency or emotional incongruence. Over time, the mind associates the day not with warmth, but with effort, obligation, or quiet discomfort, which further reduces its emotional appeal. Eventually, neutrality becomes the most comfortable position because it avoids both disappointment and forced engagement. The individual no longer measures the day against an internal standard because the standard itself has been dissolved by experience. There is no longer a sense of something missing because nothing is expected to appear. This absence of expectation creates emotional stability, even if it also removes intensity. For the mind, stability is often preferable to fluctuation, especially when fluctuation has historically leaned toward dissatisfaction rather than fulfillment. The repetition of emotionally unremarkable Christmases teaches the nervous system that heightened engagement is unnecessary. As a result, the day loses its capacity to activate emotional memory in a meaningful way, remaining cognitively recognized but emotionally dormant. The individual remembers what Christmas represents culturally, but does not feel compelled to internalize that representation. Memory, in this case, functions as a filter, allowing the individual to move forward without carrying unresolved emotional residue from previous years. This filtering process is subtle and efficient, reducing emotional load rather than increasing it. There is no internal conflict between what the day is supposed to mean and what it actually feels like, because the supposed meaning has already been adjusted to match lived reality. In this state, Christmas becomes familiar rather than significant, known rather than anticipated, and therefore emotionally ordinary. The person moves through it with the same internal posture they bring to other days, steady, observant, and unaffected by symbolic weight. The past no longer exerts pressure on the present, because memory has done its work, refining expectation until neutrality feels natural. And within that neutrality, the individual finds not emptiness, but relief. Because the emotional system is no longer required to prepare for an outcome that experience suggests will not arrive. For people who experience Christmas as a normal day, the sense of distance that appears during the season is not always physical or social, but psychological, forming quietly as they observe others engaging emotionally in a way that no longer feels natural to mirror. This distance does not emerge from judgment or superiority, but from misalignment, where the internal emotional state does not synchronize with the collective atmosphere that surrounds the day. As celebrations intensify, decorations appear, conversations shift, and emotional cues become louder, the individual notices the contrast, not as pain, but as difference, recognizing that their internal rhythm remains unchanged while the external world accelerates around them. Psychologically, humans are wired to mirror emotion, yet mirroring requires resonance, and when resonance is absent, imitation feels artificial rather than connective. For these individuals, watching others celebrate can feel observational rather than participatory, as if they are present without being internally engaged. They may understand the joy, nostalgia, or excitement expressed by others, yet feel no internal impulse to join that emotional movement, creating a quiet separation that exists without conflict. This separation often becomes more visible during moments of shared enthusiasm, when laughter, rituals, and emotional expressions are amplified by social reinforcement. Rather than feeling excluded, the individual often feels still, grounded in an internal state that does not require amplification or validation. From a psychological perspective, this reflects emotional differentiation, where a person maintains their own emotional boundaries, even in emotionally charged environments. Emotional differentiation allows an individual to remain connected without becoming emotionally absorbed, which can feel stabilizing for those who value internal consistency over emotional intensity. As others lean into collective emotion, the individual remains anchored, noticing the contrast without interpreting it as a problem that needs resolution. Social comparison may occur briefly, but it does not dominate the experience, because the individual no longer measures emotional health by alignment with group emotion. They may notice that others seem energized by the season, while they themselves remain unchanged. Yet this observation rarely leads to self-criticism. Instead, it reinforces the understanding that emotional experience is not uniform and that participation does not require internal duplication of feeling. This internal stance reduces pressure because there is no demand to perform joy, nostalgia, or warmth in order to belong. Belonging, for these individuals, is not defined by emotional display, but by presence without pretense. They can sit at a table, walk through a gathering, or move through public spaces decorated for celebration while remaining internally neutral, without feeling that something essential is being withheld or denied. This neutrality allows them to observe the mechanics of celebration with clarity, noticing how emotion spreads through reinforcement, expectation, and shared narrative rather than spontaneous internal alignment. They may recognize how strongly environment shapes feeling, how music, imagery, and social cues work together to guide emotional response, while also recognizing that these cues do not operate equally on everyone. This awareness can deepen the sense of distance, not as alienation, but as perspective. The individual sees the celebration rather than being carried by it, understanding it as a social phenomenon rather than a personal necessity. In some cases, this distance creates a sense of quiet relief, because there is no obligation to match energy, to respond with enthusiasm, or to contribute emotionally beyond what feels authentic. The absence of emotional obligation preserves internal integrity, allowing the individual to remain present without internal strain. They are not resisting the celebration, but simply not absorbing it. Psychologically, this state often develops in individuals who have learned that emotional alignment cannot be forced without cost. For them, emotional honesty matters more than emotional conformity, even when conformity would make social interactions smoother. Over time, this preference solidifies, making emotional distance during holidays feel normal rather than isolating. The individual may notice that conversations revolve around shared memories, traditions, or expectations that do not hold emotional weight for them, yet they listen without resentment. They understand that meaning is being exchanged, even if they are not the recipient. This understanding allows them to remain calm rather than defensive, present rather than withdrawn. They do not feel the need to explain their neutrality because it does not feel like a loss that requires justification. The distance remains internal, subtle, and largely invisible to others. In moments where the contrast becomes more pronounced, such as collective excitement or emotional expression, the individual may briefly feel out of sync, but this feeling passes without attachment. There is no longing to return to a previous state, because the current state feels stable and sufficient. Rather than feeling behind or disconnected, the individual often feels temporally aligned with themselves, moving through the day at a consistent pace while others move in emotional waves. This creates a quiet sense of autonomy, where emotional experience is self-governed rather than externally dictated. The individual can appreciate the celebration as an observer appreciates a scene, without needing to step into it. This observational stance does not diminish their capacity for connection elsewhere, but clarifies where connection naturally arises and where it does not. Christmas, in this context, becomes a moment where emotional difference becomes visible, but not problematic. The individual simply occupies a different internal space, one that does not require alignment with the collective mood. And within that space, there is calm, continuity, and an absence of internal conflict, allowing the day to pass without resistance, without longing, and without the sense that something essential is happening elsewhere. For people who experience Christmas as a normal day, the preference for ordinary time over emotionally elevated moments is often rooted in a deep psychological association between stability and safety, where predictability feels more trustworthy than days that carry heavy, symbolic expectation. Special days introduce an invisible demand, suggesting that something meaningful should happen internally, that emotion should rise to meet the significance assigned to the moment, and that connection should arrive simply because the calendar insists upon it. For individuals who have learned to regulate themselves internally, this demand can feel intrusive rather than inviting, because it disrupts an emotional balance that has been carefully maintained. Ordinary days carry no such pressure, allowing experience to unfold without comparison, without anticipation, and without the risk of emotional mismatch between what is expected and what actually occurs. Christmas, as a culturally amplified event, magnifies this contrast by placing emotional weight on a single day, increasing vulnerability for those whose past experiences have taught them that heightened expectation often leads to disappointment or emotional strain. Rather than resisting this pressure, the individual simply does not engage with it, allowing the day to pass without internal amplification or emotional negotiation. This response is not avoidance, but adaptation, shaped by repeated exposure to situations where emotional elevation carried more cost than reward. Over time, the nervous system begins to associate neutrality with regulation and clarity, while associating special occasions with unpredictability and internal disturbance. Treating Christmas as ordinary becomes a way of preserving internal coherence, ensuring that emotional stability is not dependent on external events or symbolic meaning. The individual does not deny the cultural significance of the day, but does not allow that significance to override lived emotional reality. They remain present without becoming emotionally exposed, engaged without feeling compelled to perform emotion that does not arise naturally. This internal posture removes the tension between what the day is supposed to feel like and how it actually feels, allowing experience to remain honest and contained. Psychologically, this reflects a prioritization of consistency over intensity, where emotional continuity feels more sustainable than emotional peaks. Emotional peaks often carry the risk of abrupt emotional decline, and for those who have experienced this pattern repeatedly, the absence of peaks feels safer than their presence. Ordinary days do not promise transformation, reunion, or emotional resolution, making them easier to inhabit fully without fear of unmet expectation. The individual moves through these days with a quiet sense of control, grounded in familiarity rather than anticipation. Christmas, when stripped of expectation, becomes indistinguishable from other days, and in that indistinguishability, the individual finds relief rather than loss. There is no emotional crash when the day ends, because there was no emotional elevation to sustain, and no sense of absence because nothing was internally promised. Meaning continues to exist, but it arrives in smaller, quieter forms, emerging through internal alignment rather than collective ritual. Moments of focus, solitude, or calm carry more weight than symbolic celebration because they feel real rather than prescribed. In this way, ordinary days become the primary space where life is experienced, while special days lose their authority over emotional meaning. Christmas passes without resistance, without anticipation, and without internal disturbance, allowing the individual to remain steady, self-contained, and aligned with their own psychological rhythm.